How long would you fight for justice for a cause you believed in? And how hard would you fight for others who couldn't fight for themselves? When I saw the 2019 film Dark Waters about one attorney's 20-year fight for justice for a small West Virginia town, I was inspired. Actor Mark Ruffalo plays attorney Rob Bilott, who also wrote the book Exposure, who spearheaded the groundbreaking fight for justice against the DuPont Corporation. In this episode of Moments of Truth, I speak with Rob Bilott. He has some sobering but profound insights for companies who think that they are immune to such disasters. Take a listen and take notes. So I want to start with you, because I think when you dig into your story, I read your book, I've watched both films twice. The level of tenacity with which you fought for so long, for so many thousands of people, against impossible odds, it takes a sense of justice that it's uncommon. I mean, it was inspiring. So I'm just curious, to what do you attribute that sense of justice? To what do you attribute those convictions? I'm going to guess law school didn't train them in you. So how do you make sense of those?
Well, I guess it's a combination of things. I think back to, just having the privilege of having met Mr. Tennant, somebody that was just absolutely passionate about the fact something very wrong was happening here. And, there was no equivocation, no gray. There was a problem. It needed to be addressed, and we needed to get to the bottom of it. And, I guess in that, combined with my view that, if people see the facts, if everybody can just look at the facts, they'll get it, they'll understand it. And I think you saw that in the scene in the movie where, I was taking the deposition of the CEO, which did occur. And I talk about that in the book as well. My goal there was to show him the facts, the reality of what's in your files. These are things that actually happened. These are the true facts. We can talk about this in a very rational way. I don't need to be shouting at you and throwing things. And, let's just go through the facts here. And we can all agree, once we've looked at this, we understand what the facts are. And that's kind of been in the back of my mind for the last several decades. If I can just get the facts out to people and they can see what I'm seeing in the objective facts of what are in the documents, what are in the studies, what are in the science, that we should all be able to see the same facts here and reach the same conclusion. So even when we got to the point of finally getting these cases to trial, again, I thought, we can just lay these facts out in front of a jury. Let's lay all of this out chronologically, all the science, all the evidence. People will see, what we're seeing here. This is not being fabricated by a bunch of plaintiffs' lawyers. I mean, these are the facts. And that happened. The jury saw that. Yet still, we had people standing up and publicly making statements that the jury didn't understand the facts. The jury didn't understand the science. This is a distortion of the reality and the science. And frankly, that's what led me to support the idea of doing the movie. To do the documentary, to try to get the story out to folks who can see for themselves what the facts were, look, the real people, what really happened. And that led to my book, because again, when I kept hearing these people say, this never happened, or this isn't the way it happened this way, trying to reinvent the history. I wanted to be able to have a resource that people could go to. Here's what really happened. If you have any questions about it, here it is.
Right? But do you think a sense of justice can be learned? Do you think leaders can learn to see the world through a lens of justice?
Yes.
And so if you were giving that advice, what would you tell them?
I guess to be open to receiving the facts and to be able to talk to people and accept what they're telling you, and provide an environment where people are free, or at least feel that they're free to come in and actually convey the truth and the facts of what's really going on without feeling like they've got to they've got to present it in a certain way, or they've got to spin it a certain way, to be taken seriously. Um, and to provide the environment where people know that will actually be listened to and taken seriously, and things are not all predetermined, and you're not there simply, to check a box, that they've had that discussion, that they're actually listening. I through the course of this litigation, just in this story, there were times where I think we finally met people that were hearing these things for the first time and were open to hearing those things and changed their views, made significant decisions, having listened and actually been receptive to what was being told to them. There were plenty of those folks, unfortunately, in the same organizations that didn't, that clearly came into discussions or to contexts in which information is being provided and simply would not listen, would not hear it. And even if they were hearing it, it was being filtered and twisted into how they wanted it to be perceived. That's, I think we all know that happens. It's incredibly frustrating, and it's rare, I guess, to find those folks, when you can have those kinds of conversations, when you feel like they're actually listening to you, they're actually receptive to hearing what the facts actually are and can make the change.
You say in the book, I was skeptical. You might say I'm professionally skeptical. DuPont was not some fly-by-night company operating under the radar of regulators. They were one of the biggest corporations in the world. They were 200 years of highly respected company-wide, considered industry leader. So you even thought maybe it sounded like a conspiracy theory when Earl first came to you. Your grandmother referred him, and you didn't want to hurt his feelings. So you took him seriously, even through your own doubt. But so when I think about the point you just made about leaders learning justice, you had to be willing to work through your own skepticism to give him his voice a chance. How'd you do it?
Absolutely. I mean, I guess that's what I was. It's interesting you picked up on that quote, because really that's kind of what I've been talking about. I mean, I went in thinking things were a certain way based on the facts I'd been given up to that point, but I guess I would like people to at least approach the way I did, which is I'm willing to listen to you. And if you come in and you present me with facts and with evidence and videotapes, photographs, whatever you have, and I see that what I was thinking was not correct, be willing to change your mind and actually be willing to take action based on that, and not feel like you've got some invested interest in maintaining whatever that prior belief was. This was a case where none of this would have happened. If we had simply stuck to our guns and said, you know what, this is not consistent with what I know about this company. You may think this is happening, but that's just doesn't make any sense to me. And it's difficult when to realize other people do not think that way, other people just refuse to have those discussions, and it's incredibly frustrating.
I'm sure there were many, but do any moments stick out for you as ones where you thought, I don't know, this is looking not good here, or you're feeling just deep discouragement?
I mean, there was that particular period of time, 2008 to 2011. When after the science panel had been set up, it was in process. It had been several years, since this process was in place, and we still weren't seeing definitive decisions being made. And meanwhile, you've got certain parties that are out there actively publishing papers in the scientific literature to support certain arguments. And you just see the deck getting stacked, and you can see it happening. And there's not much you can do about it, but I see it happening, and all we can do is provide the facts. We can educate our science panel, copy both sides, but be aware this is happening. Look who's publishing this. Just be aware. Here are the facts, and just hope that they get it. What the facts are, what's really going on. But that was during the economic collapse as well. And whether or not, anybody would still be around at that point, whether the firms could even be around. And you've got people dying in the meantime, calling every day. You saw that depicted in the movie, where throughout all of this, people are saying, "What the heck's going on?" But again, it was in the back of my mind. The only thing that really kept me going through all that was the idea that I've seen what I saw in those internal studies. I saw what the science was saying. There's no way they can recreate that.
Right.
And if anything, we're going to be able to further support it. It's just a matter of time before we can put it to paper. But it was incredibly frustrating to know whether it would ever happen.
What advice would you give that person who faced their version of the FDA that suddenly wasn't the hero anymore they wanted to be? How do you help them keep going?
Well, I think the screenwriters did a great job with there's a scene, with Mark Ruffalo outside of the restaurant saying, we protect this, we have to do this. And really, I've learned that again, also the hard way, because once I realized, look, getting all of this information, getting all the facts out to, first it was the state regulators. We had to realize that wasn't going to go anywhere. Then there was the federal regulators that we realized this isn't necessarily going to change anything. Then it was, well, if we can get it out to the public through the media, through the press, through the organizations that can make this information available. At least back then, you still had active investigative journalism departments at major newspapers. There were still media that could really dig in to stories like this, complicated stories, and actually get that out there.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, what we're seeing now, as you know, that really isn't as much of an option anymore. And getting information out to the public has become incredibly difficult, particularly as everything gets condensed into these 5-second sound bites, or something that can be easily tweeted or with some picture that goes out. Nobody wants to spend the time to read any of this, and the media has been sort of disbanded, at least a lot of these investigative journalism. So you're kind of brought it all back down to the individuals, having to take action to get this information out. And I had the incredible opportunity to be able to do that through a movie, through the documentary, through doing a book, because a lot of these traditional systems, that most folks would think would take care of these things, our regulators, the media, the just don't necessarily work.
What are the implications today of companies' abilities to hide misconduct? I mean, does that advantage them to be able to hide what they don't want to share?
I unfortunately, as a lawyer, I hate to say that, but I think the way in which discovery has changed over the years makes it a lot easier to do that. In fact, we saw some of that, I believe, starting a little bit toward the end of our litigation, when the electronic discovery started. And people started to realize that the way this worked is if certain terms were used in the documents, they get pulled up and they would get produced. So we started seeing things like, instead of saying PFOA in the document, suddenly you had people referring to it as PF ... or Elephant Project or Project Elephant. I mean, ways in which they knew this would not get picked up in the search for PFOA. And I, no doubt things like that continue to this day.
If you had to sort of put on your armchair psychologist or armchair diagnostician to say, what causes a company? What are the factors, the hubris, the level of impenetrability that causes a company to believe they can make the choices of denying this and be okay with it? Like what sets the stage for that?
I think in this particular situation, you had this really kind of unusual context in which this is a company that had prided itself on being the science company, and in fact had kind of invented a lot of the scientific processes that the regulatory agencies used. DuPont obviously was around many years before the EPA even existed. US EPA comes into existence in 1970. The Haskell labs had been in existence for decades and decades before that, with thousands of scientists. And in fact, the Haskell lab, some of those people helped invent the field of toxicology and how you go about sampling animals and how you do those tests and how do you properly interpret them. So when the agency is set up, DuPont is looked to almost as a mentor, on these are the guys, these are the science. And I think a lot of that kind of permeated through, that we are the science company, and what we say about the science, how can it be questioned? So, to have folks questioning the conclusions that their scientists were making, or that their people interpreting their scientists were making, was just something that would not be accepted at all. We're not going to have anybody questioning what our view. I mean, we are the science. We invented this field. How dare you suggest, that we're not interpreting this correctly? When you create the rules and you create the standards and the tests and the whole system by which, these things are judged, and the way in which the science is supposed to be done and how you analyze it. And if you've got the people that have been the ones setting that process up, it's very difficult to have outside parties telling them they're not interpreting it correctly.
So if you were sitting in front of a leadership team, a successful leadership team of a company, and said, gosh, we never want to be in a story like that. We don't ever want to be seen as doing harm, as with that kind of hubris. What do we do? What has to be true about our organization to avert that? What would you tell them?
It sounds simplistic, but you just have to be willing to listen to people with an open mind, and not in the context of some self-created construct in which the data has to fit into a certain peg, or you don't pay any attention to it, or it has to come to you a certain way. I mean, you've got to be willing to reassess the whole thing if you need to. And you've got to have people who are in that position who aren't personally somehow invested in maintaining that system, to always be this way, and this is the way we do it. To be open to the fact that, gee, maybe we didn't see that, or maybe there's a different way we ought to be looking at it. Just like what we did with Mr. when he walked in our door. Gee, maybe there is something here. Maybe there is some chemical we never even thought about that's out there.
But I'm grateful for exemplars like you whose stories are ones we can all learn from. So thank you for that, and thank you for making me time to chat today.
Well, thanks. As a lawyer, I still always think it's not me. It's I'm grateful to Earl Tennant and Joe Kiger. I mean, those are the people that really had the courage, to stand up, and they had to live in that community. They had to be there every day facing these people whose livelihood they were challenging. I mean, those were the real heroes in my view.
Well, and I completely concur. And yet, without a champion like you, who knows where the story would have gone. So I thank you for your time today. We've all watched one of those Law & Order episodes on TV, and heard Stabler and Benson read someone their Miranda rights. You have the right to a lawyer, and if you can't afford a lawyer, one will be provided for you. Now, these words are deeply misleading, as it's only true for criminal cases. Because it's expensive, 80% of low-income people are not receiving the legal counsel they need. Unresolved legal problems often lead to homelessness and job loss, wage theft, health problems, and more. In this episode of Everyday Justice, Jarrod Shappell talks with Adian Tirtanadi, Executive Director at Open Door Legal, on how he believes providing legal representation gets at the root of these issues before they escalate, and dramatically reducing poverty and helping thousands of struggling families live stable, joyful, and dignified lives. Take a listen.
Today, I am thrilled to introduce you to Adian Tirtanadi. Thank you for being here with us today. He leads a group called Open Door Legal here in San Francisco, California, and I'm just so excited for you to get to hear a little bit more about his work and their mission and what they're doing. Because when I first heard about it, I was deeply moved. So again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here and share a little bit about why I'm so passionate about our work.
Yeah, well, maybe you could just start there. Tell me a little bit more about your work and your organization and a bit of its origins.
So we're called Open Door Legal, as you said. We started in 2013. Actually, I co-founded it with my friend, and it was a sort of long journey for me. The culmination of many, many years of thinking about how to best address poverty in America. Actually, I had come up with this thesis that legal aid was the most effective way to address poverty, but there wasn't a lot of sort of research around it. So I thought the best way to prove it was actually to go to law school and start the org. And that's what I did. And our mission is to pioneer the country's first system of universal access to legal help and start that in San Francisco's communities of color, eventually scale citywide, and then become a model for national replication. And to reach a point where essentially you could not have a credible conversation on poverty in America if you didn't at least mention legal aid and civil justice.
So like maybe double click on that, because I think, when I hear that, I'm like, that is a profound thesis. So, why is legal representation a justice issue? Why do you see it as so deeply tied to poverty? I think, a lot of times people think healthcare, or people think about work, or they think about, even some of the education or some of these other systemic issues. But legal representation, why do you see that as so closely tied to poverty in America?
Well, so let's start with, how does it relate to justice? Essentially, one way I think about it is an inaccessible justice system is functionally equivalent to a corrupt justice system, right? If you lose your case because you can't get legal help, you will feel the same. All the functional kind of effects will be the same as if you lost your case because the judge was bribed, right? And in our country, we have built our justice system on the premise that both sides will be represented by lawyers. I mean, even to do something like introduce evidence so the judge can consider it requires a lawyer, right? So you run into the situation where we don't provide lawyers to people who are low income in civil issues. And this means that they will systematically lose their cases. And this means that functionally, right, they don't have enforceable property rights. They don't have enforceable contract rights. They don't have enforceable family rights. And this then leads to a lot of poverty in our country. So I'll give you one example. It's hard to conceptualize that for people who don't have a lot of legal issues, but one of our clients from this year was an elderly widow, and, she had, and her husband had bought a home in San Francisco 25 years ago. And unfortunately, her husband had died suddenly of cancer. And so she made the mortgage for 24 years, spent half of her income on this mortgage, and saved up about $750,000 in equity. And then she developed dementia and started missing payments, and the bank moved to foreclose on the property. They ended up selling the property for $50,000. They sent her a check for 1 penny to represent the 25 years of investment she had put in. And then the investment group that bought the property moved to evict her. And that's when she came to us. And we discovered that the bank actually lacked the legal authority to foreclose in the first place. And they knew it, right? But they decided to do it anyways. And so we were able to reverse the foreclosure, get title back in her name, get her mortgage paid off, her consumer debt paid off, all of her equity restored, the taxes reset, and we wrote a trust so she could pass on that asset to her daughter. So she went from almost being homeless to being able to pass down a nearly $1 million asset. And, you know, what's crazy in a sense is not the details of that story, but how common that is. You know, one study in San Francisco found that 84% of foreclosures were done with a major legal violation, meaning they could have been voided if people had been able to get legal help, but virtually nobody was. So that's just one issue, right? And you can already see the millions and billions of dollars in value that is essentially stolen from low-income people across the country, right? And we could tell very similar stories in, you know, employment law, in family law, in housing law, in immigration law. And the reason why it's not really thought of that often is because essentially these kinds of issues don't really happen to people with more privilege, right? And so they don't understand, and then they're not visible on the relief side. You know, if our client had lost her home and was living in a shelter, we would only see this as a homeless issue. We wouldn't see this as a justice issue.
You know, we're calling this segment Everyday Justice. And I think, you know, sometimes when we're talking big ideas and, you know, terrible inequalities and nationwide injustices, it can feel really big. You know, you will solve this issue, I believe. But I'm curious, just, you know, for somebody just learning about this injustice and coming to understand the power of representation, it's connected to poverty as an example. What do you say to somebody that just wants to make a change tomorrow in how they are living their lives to create a more just society? What's something that you've learned or something that you could offer folks who are thinking about changes they can make?
I would, you know, I think the reason why justice, these sort of everyday justices, as you phrase, aren't sort of top of mind for a lot of people, it's not because they're not happening everywhere, right? It's because people aren't really proximate and the media doesn't cover it, right? So, you know, if I told you like we've had a case like Miss Powbray on every block in Bayview, right? You know, you might be shocked, right? Or if I brought up a map and showed you, I've done this with some of our donors and showed like, you know, on your block, we've represented 5 people and they had no idea, right? Or, you know, we had a gala and we showed the story of this immigrant woman who was fighting to keep her son in the country, and we were able to get her son in the country. And one of our donors came to us and was like, was our nanny, and we had no idea she was going through this, right? And so it's really hard to do things like raise money when nobody even knows about the issue, right? And when sort of injustice is happening in China are like 100x more reported than what's going on in your own community, you know? So I would encourage people to get proximate, you know, really learn people's stories. Now, people aren't just gonna, the first time they meet you, tell them about the worst time they were ever treated in their life, you know? And then once you kind of learn to understand it, I would really encourage people to donate and to volunteer. You know, one thing you said, which is true, is how like 90% of lawyers serve 10% of the population. You know, we have this weird dichotomy where we have more lawyers per capita than any country in the world, except for maybe 2 others. And yet we're ranked 99th in the world in access to civil justice, right? And a large part of that is because of the very low rates of pro bono by people in private practice. So, you know, I think, but we can't just blame lawyers, right? This is about all of us and the kind of society we want to create. And what I have found really helpful with people is just to help them understand the linkage between justice and poverty, right? And that seems to resonate really strongly with a lot of people.
Yeah, it certainly resonates with me, and I hope it resonates with the people that are watching today. I'm just so grateful for your work. Your vision is inspiring, and I believe that it will come to pass, that you will create a more just, accessible system for people. And I'm just really grateful for your time and sharing your story and your work today. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks again for inviting me on. It was really fun.
Yeah, thanks again.
Having stood up in front of a whole room full of people and lied, I knew what I had to do. If I wanted to be true to my purpose, I could no longer work at that company, whose well-intended duplicity put me in a position where I chose dishonesty. I'd become a living example of a statistic I would later discover in the research for this book. When a company's actions and words don't match, people are 3 times more likely to be dishonest and behave unfairly. I feared that if I compromised once, I would do it again if I didn't leave right away. So I left. That moment revealed 2 fundamental, often warring needs we humans come hardwired with. First, our deep-seated need to matter. We want to know that our existence has significance. And second, when that need goes unmet, we default to indulging the other need, to look like we matter. Looking smart, put together, competent, and good to others becomes the need we pander to when the former isn't satisfied. And when you confuse one for the other, compromise becomes all too easy, and you have stepped onto the slippery slope. And what happens when we don't back away from the slope? We slip. Think about it. Till next time. Keep leaning into your moments of truth so that you can be the example of what it means to be honest.